everybody, welcome to the Chess Harbor. My name is Raf, and today I am back with another Road to Masters gameplay. This time I was playing quite a strong opponent in the Club Chess Championship. I know that he is quite a strong opponent, as I have played against him in the past, and I've never managed to win a single game, or even play for a draw, as a matter of fact. And his rating used to be well over 2,000 a couple of years ago. He dropped off a little bit because of some inactivity, but he's definitely a very strong player. So I decided in the end to go with my main repertoire here, to be as solid as possible, to try and play for a better result and a loss this time. I decided to play the move d4, and he responded with the move knight to f6. For those of you who've watched the channel before, know that I'm a very big fan of bishop to g5, so that is exactly what I played. And here my opponent has a couple of options, going for the sharp knight e4, or the more solid e3, or e6 rather. He played the move d5, which is also another very solid move, but it does allow me to grab the knight if I want to. I've shied away from this move in the past. I used to play knight takes, and after one of the pawn takes, go for a setup with pawn to g3. Going for more like a Catalan kind of structure, playing against these damaged pawns with the bishop on the long diagonal, which is a very solid way for white to play, but it's also quite a dull way for white to play. So I've kind of given up on this approach. I've favored the more active approach, trying to keep some more pieces on, and that is done by a move knight to c3 here. And this transposes the variation to the Richter-Veresov variation now, which can also be reached from a d4, d5, knight to c3 move order. It's kind of a brother from the likes of the Jubava London, maybe. This kind of move signals white's intention of maybe castling long, going for some kind of setup with f3 and e4, taking over the center and playing a more aggressive kind of game. That's what I've been favoring more nowadays. In this kind of position, black again has multiple options, as you could have maybe seen in some of the theory videos that I have been making. Knight b2 d7 is black's main option, being the most solid. There is also other options like bishop to f5, and that is what my opponent played in this game. He played bishop to f5, which is a very solid approach, going for a kind of London-esque approach, putting the pawns on c6, putting the pawn on e6, going for a kind of London approach, very solid for black. And here in this variation, I think it's best for white to now take, and black has two options: taking with the e-pawn or taking with the g-pawn. Black took with the g-pawn, which signals two things. The rook is going to come to the g-file at some point, pressurizing my king side, and also his king side is weakened, which means that his king is probably never going to end up there, and his king is going to end up on the queen side at some point. Now this is very interesting, as it definitely has some things to think about. In general, in this position, it's much slower because the bishop has moved outside of the pawn chain. There is no real immediate threats for white to take over the center. So he played more quietly with the move e3. And now my opponent immediately plays rook to g8, which is very interesting because it pressurizes the g2 pawn, and it actually made me think that bishop to d3 was not an option anymore. And I have to admit here that I probably should be a little bit more booked up on the theory here, and I completely didn't see that bishop to d3 here is entirely possible. Let me show you why. Because after bishop to d3, bishop takes on d3, queen takes on g3, you'd think that the g2 pawn is completely hanging here, but white actually has a nice move with queen to b5 check. The only move is knight to d7 to block the check, because after queen takes, you're going to lose the rook in the corner, and after c6, you also just lose the b pawn. And actually, white is going to be a little bit better there. But after knight to d7, you have a choice between taking the d-pawn and the b-pawn, but taking the d-pawn here is obviously much better, as now you're hitting the rook, and you've also got an extra central pawn now. And you can play quite comfortably against these damaged pawns, and white is going to be much better after queen to f3. There is just pressure along the entire board. White can immediately castle, and it's going to be in for a nice game. So bishop to d3 here was an entirely possible move. I feel like I definitely should have had something prepared against this probably, but I actually never really faced rook to g1 or rook to g8 so early on, which didn't really give me a lot of insight in this move. So I decided to play knight, after rook to g8, I decided to play knight g to e2, with the simple idea of bringing the knight over to the g3 square, which hits the bishop and also blocks the g file. So that's exactly what the game goes. My opponent played c6, very solid, and I played knight to g3, hitting the bishop, so bishop drops back, and now finally bishop to d3. So the main idea in this position is to trade off these bishops, but I don't want to be the one who instigates this trade. I want to make black make this trade, because after bishop takes on d3, I have the very pleasant choice of either c takes on d3 or queen takes on d3, with a very comfortable structure for black, or for white, sorry, where I have an open c file or a potential just the queen here, which is very actively placed, and then I have a very simple idea of playing f4 with a kind of stonewall structure where I don't have a bad piece anymore, with the dark square bishop already being traded off. And here my opponent, he kind of realized that trading here is no longer a good option for black, so he played queen to b6, which is another very important moment already in the game, as this is an annoying move because it hits the b2 pawn, and dropping the b2 pawn here might not be the best idea, so I have to do something about that. And my first initial thought was to play the move a3, which is a classic trap. After queen takes, you have knight to e4, which would trap the queen, because there is no viable square for the queen to escape to, so the queen would be lost. Of course, I didn't think my opponent was going to fall for this, but after not playing a3, he could actually take on b2, so I have to at least make the threat. But after thinking about this for a while, I didn't really feel comfortable after the move e5, with black just taking over the entire center here. So in the end, I decided not to go for that. Another way of playing would be knight to a4, protecting my pawn this way, but after queen to b4 check, c3, queen d6, e5 is again very much on the table, and the knight feels a little bit loose here, potentially being trapped by b5. So that also felt a little bit bad. And the last move I thought about was rook to b1, which is what I played in the end, but it turns out, again, white can just ignore the threat that black made and play castles. After queen takes on b2, you have a very interesting move, queen to e1. This is clearly some kind of engine move, which is very subtle. It defends the knight, it defends the rook. But the idea behind this move is that the only good move here is that you can go back with the queen, queen to b6, and now still rook b1, queen to c7, and you have the move e4, well supported by the knight and the bishop, and even by the queen. And after d takes, knight takes, you have a very strong threat of taking on f6, or going with the knight to d6 with pin on the king. And there is very big threats here. For example, bishop to g7 here. There is a very nice move for white. I'll give you 5 seconds to pause the video and find an amazing resource for white in this position. I hope you found the move rook takes on b7. Amazing deflection tactic. After queen takes, you have the knight picking up the queen with a nice pin along the e file. A very nice resource here for white. So this sequence with castles followed by queen to e1, clearly some kind of engine preparation, which I didn't know about. Yeah, very interesting to actually learn about this afterwards, after the game. But here, after a long think, I think I thought about 15 minutes about this position already, because it was such an important moment already. I played rook to b1, which is in general just a fine move. The rook is not misplaced on the b file, because with this kind of Carlsbad structure, often b4, b5 is the main idea. So the rook is already well placed for that. So rook to b1, and now my opponent played knight to d7, not immediately committing to e5, but setting up for it more. And here I could have played the move f4, which is again a very big turning point in the game. I thought for another 10 to 15 minutes about this move, going for either f4 or h4 here. But after f4, I was really worried that the move e5 would just blow white's position apart, because I can't take here, because then the queen comes in on e3 and I would be completely losing. So after taking here, after after f takes on e5, I've undoubled black's pawns, and black just looks so much more solid here. Again, I can't take because black caves in on e3, so I can't do that, and black just looks so much better. My king is weak and black has the entire center here, so that felt so uneasy to play the move f4. It turns out that again white can just ignore everything after e5 here, and just play the move f5. And here white would be better, or even if you don't take on e5, you could just castle here and you'd also be better. Yeah, it turns out that sometimes ignoring your opponent's threats is just so much better than actually going for the forced sequences. But I gave up on the move f4 after a long think. I decided to play the move h4. So kind of carrying out the threat that I said earlier, that I want to try and force black's bishop to take my bishop instead of the other way around. So here my opponent played the move e5 finally, and now I play the move h5. So I'm forcing black's bishop to do something, takes on d3 of course, and now I take back with the queen. I can no longer take back with the pawn, because after e takes, I'm going to lose a pawn, so I can't do that. So I have to take with the queen in this position, but I'm okay with that. The queen is actually well placed. It hits the h pawn, potential of coming into the f5 square, where it targets some weak points, and it also supports the knight maybe coming to f5 at some point. So my opponent felt the need to close the position with e4, which is probably one of black's better options. You're claiming some very important space here, but I didn't really feel all that bad about this position either. So I drop back with queen to d1. The black issue is still these kind of double pawns, a very nice outpost potential on f5 or even f4, and I have a long game ahead of me playing against these double pawns, although the position is definitely a little bit sharper, because pushing my pawn up to h5 means that my king is not going to be all that safe on the king side either. So very often the king is going to sit on f1, as we'll see later. So my opponent played queen to c7, and as I just mentioned, in this position I played king to f1. There is some not so subtle threat of sacking something on g3 here. So for example, if I play the move b4, then rook takes on g3, f takes on g3, queen takes on g3 check, king to f1. This position with queen takes on e3, yeah, black has already won back all their material. They've sacked the rook for a knight and 2 pawns, which is more than enough compensation considering my king is extremely weak and black's king is going to find safe shelter on the queen side. So I didn't want to go into that kind of position. So after queen to c7, I played king to f1 with the idea that after rook takes, I can now take back with the pawn, and there is not going to be a check with taking on e3, so I would be okay here. And the engine actually recommends rook takes on f3 as still the best move, but here, instead of being worse, white is actually okay after the move rook to h3, which protects the e3 pawn, and I definitely feel like white should be the one still playing for an advantage here, considering that you're still an exchange up for only 1 pawn. But my opponent didn't go for this. After king to f1, he played rook to g5, which is a nice move. It stops my knight coming to f5, which was obviously my next idea, blocking this kind of pawns. Also after bishop takes, you can always chop off the bishop, so the knight is excellently placed on f5 here. So I decided after rook to g5, why not start my counterplay on the queen side and play the move b4. I want to go b5, blast open the king side, and really undermine this kind of structures, make sure that his king on the queen side would not find any safety either. So after b4, my opponent played bishop to d7, setting up some kind of tricks on g3 again, So here I decided, I was thinking a long time again, because of course this is quite a dangerous position. I was thinking a long time how to protect against this kind of threat. Maybe even something like rook to h3 or knight c to e2. In the end, I decided that I'd move this knight to e2 with the idea that I'd want to play g3 and put the knight on f4. That to me felt like a very safe way of playing. Also, just this knight being still on the c file, obviously it wants to do something on the queen side too. Maybe coming to c5 would be an excellent way to put some queenside pressure. So I didn't really want to move my knight on the queen side just yet. And here my opponent just castled, and I decided to play the move g3. So now my king side is rock solid. There is no kind of sacrifices left on g3, because now my knight covers it, my pawn covers it, and there is no checks to be found. Also, my queen can very easily come into the defense, or my rook can come into defense. So the queen side or the king side is very safe now. Now rook d to g8, still kind of threatening something on the queen side, but as I just said, the queen side is the king side is rock solid now. So I played b5. I want to get this counterplay going. My opponent also wants to get a counterplay going on the king side, so he plays the move f5. And here white is definitely better, as the king on the queen side is not safer than the king on the king side. And I played b takes on c6. My opponent has to respond to this, because otherwise my rook isn't going to cave in on the b file, or if my pawn takes on the b file, yeah, the position is definitely going to liven up very much, and I don't think that I can say that I'm worse there. So he plays b takes on c6, and now I played knight to f4. So I want to plug up the king side, make sure that there is nothing going on here, and opening up the e2 square for my queen, because my queen wants to join in on my own attack. So my opponent immediately chops off the knight, as he definitely thought that was too good of a piece, but it's actually not a good move by black. Giving up this bishop so easily is definitely no good. I take back with the e-pawn, which hits the rook. The rook has to move. The rook goes back to g7. And now queen to e2. My idea to bring the rook, or the queen and the rook, into the attack is actually way too strong for black to handle. And my opponent here played queen to a5, which during the game I thought was an absolutely brilliant move. I really struggled to actually find the correct continuation here for white. As the knight is being hit, I definitely felt like white should be better here. And after some analysis and looking at this position with the engine, seeing how white can continue here, yeah, you just see that white is super dominant. There's nothing black can do, and white is just gonna mop up this game at this point. And the winning move here would be knight to d1, with the idea of sacrificing the a pawn and going with the knight to e3. But I had looked at this idea because obviously the knight was super good on the e3 square, and moving the knight immediately was a way of not making it drop, because it is attacked right now. And knight to d1, queen to a2 just looked so scary to me, dropping a pawn for no real immediate compensation. But it turns out that here rook to b3 is the correct move. I couldn't really see how I can defend my rook in that kind of position, where I'm not just down a pawn with no compensation. Turns out that after rook b3, let's say king to c7, to get some kind of shelter from this idea, after queen or after knight to e3, the f pawn is so loose that white is still much better, and this pawn is not going anywhere. The rooks are really just not doing anything either. So this position is completely dominant for white. I couldn't see that during my analysis. And I thought so long about this position because not moving the knight and defending the knight instead also looked very, very bad. So I think I thought about 30 minutes about this position to eventually play rook to b3, which does turn out to be an okay move. The engine still gives a nice advantage to white. And here my opponent responded with knight to b6, which is what I expected. I had expected that he wanted to move the knight to c6, to c4, which is just the best spot for the knight on the board. That's quite clear, as it is a very strong outpost, where it puts some pressure on the e3 square as well, potentially forcing e3 through could weaken this kind of kingside structure, which would in turn make these rooks viable again. So that was, yeah, it was quite clear that black is going to try and play that, and I had looked at this position for about half an hour, and I thought I had come up with a nice solution here with king to g2, making sure that I can bring the other rook over. And I had looked at this quite deeply after c4, knight to c4, rook h to b1, and now I had thought that if he plays a move like e3, I would be completely winning here. A move like queen to d3, which hits the weak f5 pawn, I can just ignore this, and this is actually mate in 5, as after queen takes on f5, there is nothing that you can do about the rook coming in together with the queen, forcing some kind of mate. So there is definitely nothing black can do about this. So e3 would be a losing mistake. But after rook hb1, my opponent must have seen something like this, I think, and he moved his king to c7, kind of stepping out of the idea of bringing my rook in. So now if I would bring my rook in, he has a d6 to run away to, which would still be okay for white. And I thought about this move, and I think I actually should have played it, because now the rook actually feels a lot more active than what it had before, and now the knight can move at some point, because definitely the knight is still attacked now. But in the end, I decided at a way too materialistic approach here, and I decided to play the move a3, which again, it's way too materialistic. It actually does work, because I still have a very nice position, but it wasn't really a move I made for the right reasons. So my opponent played king to d6 now. His king is actually very active. My rooks don't feel like they're doing much on the b file. So I definitely felt like I was a little bit under pressure here, even though white is winning. Optically, it didn't really feel that way, as I thought the threat of e3 was super strong together with these rooks. Also, knight to d2 is potentially dangerous, and the queen is still eyeing my knight, so I have to be very careful here. In the end, after again a very long think, I came up with queen to e1, which is actually a good move here. It sets up some kind of tricks of some discovered attack against the queen, with check because the king is now on a checkable square by the knight. So if he would move his knight, let's say he plays something daft like queen to b6, I have knight takes on e4, winning the queen. There is no way in his right mind that my opponent didn't see this, but having these kind of tactics at your disposal is always nice in the heat of the moment. But I was so low on the clock because I was feeling under pressure that yeah, the position is very hard to play for me. And here my opponent did finally play the move e3, and is actually a mistake here, which yeah, because I was already so low on time, I didn't respond to correctly. And while analyzing the game afterwards, I found the correct move, which is rook to b7, because if my opponent takes on f2, it's mate in 1, which is one of the nice ideas behind queen to e1 earlier, that my queen could become active along the e file. But during the game, I didn't find the move rook to b7 because I was already very low on time. I started looking at more defensive moves, which is not entirely that good in a position this complex. It's a very sharp position. You should mostly be looking at attacking moves and not defending moves here. But in the end, I came up with the move rook to d1, which is not a super good move, but I was a little bit too worried about knight coming into d2, in combination with threats of taking on f2 here. I was somewhat prepared to sacrifice the queen for 2 rooks if it had to come down to this, but it definitely didn't feel like a good position. So I came up with the move rook to d1 here, with the idea of maybe eventually bringing my rook over to d3 and defending laterally on g3 here. And if the pawn actually takes, which is what my opponent played, I would not take with the queen, because if I take with the queen, then yeah, this position would actually be hopeless to play, which is not something I want. But here I'd take back with the king, because again, there is so many tactics in this position that if my opponent takes here with the rook, I have knight to b5 check, and the rook again defends laterally, and I pick up the rook for the knight. So that would be a nice tactic here. So after king takes on f2, my opponent decided to try and bring more pieces into the attack with queen to d8. But queen to d8 turns out to be an even bigger mistake than what I did earlier with rook to d1. And here I can find some activity on the queen side finally with knight to a4. And I'm threatening queen to b4 check. I'm threatening knight to c5. There is some kind of threats maybe along the e-file at some point. I was envisioning at this point, when during the game here, I actually finally saw the idea of rook to b7 with some kind of queen coming in, which I only saw afterwards. That was a tactic that worked much earlier. And here my opponent played rook to e8 to stop some kind of threats, but it allowed me to play queen to b4 check. And we're only on move 31 here, but I had about a minute left on the clock, so I was playing on increment. I was playing quite panicked. I have to make 9 more moves before I get extra half an hour, so it definitely, it got my heart racing a bit. I couldn't really think all that long at this point, so my opponent played king to c7, and actually the best move for white, and this is really crazy sequence, or best move for black, sorry, the really crazy sequence, actually king to e6 here is black's best move. Going to the f6 square is actually the most safe option, and white is a little bit better because you're going to win the b7 pawn, and the knight's going to come to c5, which is a strong outpost, but black still has a good knight on c4, and you're finally going to get the rooks into the game, and the game, yeah, white should be a little bit better, but it definitely doesn't feel like much of an accomplishment there. So if my opponent played that, I don't think I might not have found the correct continuation with only 1 minute left on the clock. So I'm quite happy after queen to b4 check, my opponent went king to c7, allowing me to get in more. And here white's best move is actually rook to e1, which is a very obscure looking move again. After rook takes on e1, you have queen takes on e1, and the queen dominates the board, the rook dominates the b file, and white is much better in this position because there is knight coming to c5, and here black's rook is a little bit off balance because it's trapped behind its own pawns currently, and you're playing almost a piece down, and white's actually much better here. But that's such a complex move. There's no way that I would have found that kind of move. Even with a lot of time on the clock, I'm not sure that I would have found that move. So in the end, I decided to go with queen to b7 check here. After king to c7, I played queen to b7. My opponent played king to d6, and I decided to repeat the position. And we repeated the position 3 times. We shook hands, and after 35 moves, I was very happy I could write the draw on my paper, as with only 1 minute on the clock, playing on increment here, it was a little bit scary that I might lose this kind of position, and I felt like it was a little bit easier for me to play at the end. I felt like I had a little advantage, but it definitely felt like a very complex position still. So I'm happy that it ended in a draw. It was an extremely interesting game, very fun to play, but especially fun to analyze afterwards, as it had such very interesting things that you can prepare, and also tactical shots. It's a very fresh position. That's exactly why I recommend the Richter-Veresov in my theory videos. I'll definitely post those in the description down below, and I hope I can convince you guys to start playing this variation as well, because after d5 knight to c3, there is definitely a lot of play for white in this position. I think it's super interesting, and I hope I can show you guys more in the next videos. Thank you for watching. I'll see you then.